Take a look at this guy. His name's Yoko Taro, a Japanese games developer and creative director. He's also a self-proclaimed weirdo who makes weird games for weird people. And given I don't know the last time he went out in public without wearing that mask, well, I'd say that description's pretty accurate. Anyways, in 2017, Square Enix and Platinum Games teamed up to release NieR Automata, Taro's top-selling and most critically acclaimed game to date. In 2021, Square Enix put out a remastered version of Taro's 2010 cult classic, NieR Replicant. And finally, just last month, the mobile gacha game NieR Reincarnation finished a solid 3-year run. Most exciting of all, it seems there's a new NieR game in the works. One that I hope will be released for the 10-year anniversary of Automata in 2027. And that should be about it. Okay, fine. I did say I was talking about the last 10 years of Taro's career. So, here we go. On this day, 10 years ago, Square Enix released Drakengard 3. In North America and Europe anyways, it released a bit earlier in Japan.
Find it! Get a medic! This crazy intoner's gonna kill us all!
Sure, why not? I haven't killed any medics yet.
It's over.
This isn't even a war.
It's goddamn manslaughter! Enter defensive formations!
What's so funny?
Manslaughter. We're fighting elves, remember? So it can't be manslaughter.
So look, I like torture as much as the next guy. Probably more, actually. But I'm not so sure you should be ripping out anyone's fingernails over some old haunch of meat.
Why not?
Why not? Because aren't allowed to.
We need permission just to of?
So Drakengard 3 is the third and likely final entry in the Drakengard series, from which the NieR series is a spin-off, and as you can probably tell from that little montage, it's a strange game, even by Yoko Taro standards. The opening narration describes the premise as follows.
Long ago, in an age tarnished by endless conflict, 5 beautiful goddesses descended upon the land. The goddesses sang mystical songs that restored peace and harmony to our broken world. The people began to worship these holy songstresses and came to refer to them as intoners. Thanks to the efforts of these intoners, the chaos of war became a distant memory. And as a result, mankind enjoyed an age of sweet reverie, basking in the newfound light and You murderous savage.
That is Zero, our protagonist who never quite makes it to hero. See, the narrator forgot to mention that there are actually 6 intoners. There are those numbered 1 through 5, who rule this allegedly utopian world, and then there's Zero, the one trying to murder them all. For reasons. The game genuinely doesn't tell you why Zero is doing what she's doing, until you get to the last of its 4 endings, something that will require you to give up around 25 hours of your time performing the following cycle. 1. Butcher hundreds of enemy soldiers and a few spongy mini-bosses in a series of on-rails levels. 2. Kill an intoner. 3. Recruit said intoner's disciple, whose entire existence revolves around a single obsession or sexual fetish. 4. Watch as the game makes fun of its own repetitiveness. 5. Repeat. And on it goes, until you finish assembling the party that, according to Zero, consists of a dummy, a psycho, a waste of space, and a pervert. As plenty of people before me have already noted, Drakengard 3 is an actively unpleasant experience no matter which way you slice it. Gameplay, graphics, story, characters, it all kind of makes you want to jump off a cliff. And when you realize that, you can do one of 2 things. You can do absolutely anything else, or you can keep playing, to try and lock the last ending to understand what the fuck is going on. I'll let you guess which one I chose. So if you slog through all the way to the end of Branch D, what do you get? Well, you get some decent characterization for the party members who aren't wastes of space, and this. A rhythm game from hell, designed to punish people who cheese the final boss of Drakengard 1. Yoko Taro. I was 2 years old when Drakengard 1 came out. That all had nothing to do with me, so why don't you take Branch D and shove it. So here's the thing about Drakengard 3. You can take everything I've just said about the game and easily conclude it's bad. I'd agree with you. And hell, so would the YouTuber ConstantlyCaden, who's on record as saying he loves the game. But there's something about this conclusion, that Drakengard 3 is just bad, that feels unsatisfying to me. Not because it's wrong, but because it's incomplete, especially if we're looking at the game in the context of the last 10 years of Taro Mania. See, I'd agree with ConstantlyCaden that Drakengard 3 is bad on purpose. And for that reason, I want to look at some different questions, instead of trying to figure out if Drakengard 3 is good or bad. Because it fucking sucks. Put simply, this retrospective is not a review. Instead, it's an attempt to answer the following questions. 1. How did a game like Drakengard 3 get made in the first place? 2. What was Taro trying to achieve with this experience? 3. Why do I and other people keep playing the game 10 years after its less than stellar release? And finally, what can Drakengard 3 tell us about the future of NieR? So if you've completed the opening sequence of Drakengard 3, and watched Mikhail piss himself for a solid 30 seconds, then wondered to yourself, how did Square Enix end up signing off on something like this? Well, that's what we're going to try figure out now. To do that, we have to take a look at earlier entries in the series, specifically Drakengard 1. After all, I doubt the producers went to Square and said, "We want you to fund something awful." No, they probably went and said, "We want you to make the third entry in a profitable franchise." So, how did Drakengard begin? Did the series start normal and then get progressively weirder? Well, from what I've played and read of Drakengard 1, I can say the answer to that last question is absolutely not. While the characters in the first installment appear to be more normal at first, they turn out to be no less vicious or perverse than their successors, and there's hardly an atrocity that goes without depiction or a taboo that goes unbroken in this first game. And all that was in 2003, mind you. It may seem surprising that Square Enix put its name to one of Taro's more demented narratives when he was still an unknown, but it all starts to make sense when you look at the company's priorities in the early 2000s. Big IPs of the day included Ace Combat and Dynasty Warriors, and the initial idea producers had for Drakengard 1 involved capturing the core gameplay loop of each of those franchises in a novel fantasy setting. And that's when the devs had to answer their first question. What's the medieval version of a fighter jet? Well, it's a dragon, I suppose. Oh, and what's that? Our first choice for director couldn't make the gig? Well, let's give it to Taro instead. And there you get Drakengard. I imagine that given the timely gameplay premise of Drakengard 1, people up top concerned with the profitability of the game were willing to let a few more things slide with its story. Or maybe they didn't even have a look at the story at all. That ended up being the case when Yosuke Saito, an external producer, went to pitch the game for the PS2. Sony reps were so burnt out at that point in the pitch season that they approved the game without even looking at it. Upon release, Drakengard met with excellent sales in Japan and a solid showing in the West. The distinct style and tone of Taro's storytelling struck a chord with many players. His cult following, which has since grown to include people such as myself, began. So that's how Drakengard began, and how Taro was able to sell his distinct, weird, grim style going forward. But as for Drakengard 3 in particular, the project got started when Taro met with Takamasa Shiba, the internal producer of the first Drakengard game. In an interview published with Square Enix, Shiba says that his goal here was to make something new for console gamers who were longtime supporters of Square IPs, at a time when the industry was seeing increased emphasis on the mobile market. I've also read on the Drakengard wiki that the game was made to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the first Drakengard game, though I'm not sure what the source for that claim is. Still, the general vibe I get is that Drakengard 3 was made as a love letter to the strange events that made the first game possible, and the even stranger fans who made it popular. Though at some points, it feels more like hate mail than a love letter. That leads to my next question. While Taro never goes so far as to interpret his games for his fans, he has talked about what informs his themes, which usually revolve around violence and the act of killing. In this Drakengard 3 pre-release interview, Taro says through this sock puppet that the inspiration for the original game and its twisted cast was the idea that, to wreak Muso levels of carnage, you'd have to be totally insane. Taro goes on to say that by the time the original NieR came around, he'd changed his view a little, and that even an ordinary person could kill others so long as they felt they were in the right. While fans have their own interpretation of these games and how they relate to the real world, I feel like this clear intent from Taro shines through to provide an engaging, coherent, thematic experience. With Drakengard 3 though, I had a hard time figuring out what the intent was. Our murderous protagonist, Zero, is callous but not insane. She doesn't frame her mission to kill the other intoners in terms of right or wrong either. She actually talks about it more as a chore or responsibility than anything else. The intoners exist because of Zero, and before she can achieve her goal and, die, she has to put her affairs in order. Zero approaches murder with less real enthusiasm than any of Taro's other protagonists, except maybe 2B.
Emotions are prohibited.
Honestly, I found it hard to relate to either of them, because when I kill people... sorry about that. Anyways, I guess you could say that Taro's intention going into Zero's journey was to argue that, past a certain point, there can be no coming back from this level of destruction. Even, or maybe especially, for someone who shows glimmers of empathy. They can't just retire to a swamp cabin, but they can clean up after themselves and find peace? Or maybe a measure of redemption?
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a robbery. Sons of Dutch. Makes us brothers.
Now that's a pretty bleak message, and it's the opposite of what you'd end up feeling once you finish NieR Automata. Which isn't to say that this bleakness isn't a big part of the Drakengard 3 experience, it's just that I find more meta explanations of what's going on here to be more satisfying. Drakengard 3 itself can be very meta, after all.
No, that's not what I...
I'll say when this ends.
So in the interview I mentioned earlier, Taro said that he felt uncertain going into Drakengard 3 about what his vision was, and that by the end of development, he came away with more questions than answers. Now on a certain level I believe that, but I also think that the key to understanding Drakengard 3 comes out later in the interview. Taro talks about what he sees as his personal failure to move the gaming industry away from its preoccupation with violence and competition. He refers to that obsession with violence as a hidden barrier developers must face in their game designs. And in closing, Taro says that there is something he wants to get across to developers around the world. Keep pushing against those barriers. Make games that don't take violence and other limitations for granted. In my view, Drakengard 3 is an extension of that message. Unlike previous installments in the series, which provide critiques of virtual and real violence, I think Drakengard 3 focuses more on violence as it surfaces in video games. You have all these one-dimensional disciples who kill to satisfy their obsessive desires. You have Zero, who kills till she's sick, and then you have the childlike Mikhail, who kills even though he doesn't want to. All the while, this mostly unlikable cast complains about bland repetition, as if to point at the player and say, "Hey, why don't you play something different?" Or, better yet, make something different. All the callbacks to Drakengard 1 reinforce that message. Like, remember that bit everyone hated towards the end? Well, here it is again. Only longer, harder, and impossible to exploit. Have fun! And that's why I say some of this feels like hate mail. It's fan service while also kinda going, again? Really? You're not sick of this yet? The funny thing is, many people weren't sick of it. People kept playing the game and its DLC and are still playing it 10 years after release. People like me. I came to Drakengard 3 late. I played through most of it last summer, and played through Automata and Replicant 2 years before that. The NieR games had been hugely inspirational for me, in that they motivated me to dig deeper into my love for video games, do more commentary, and make games of my own. With Drakengard 3, I guess I wanted to get a bigger picture of this franchise that had had such a huge impact on me. Instead, I got a flesh monster made out of orphans. Yikes. The reason I stuck with Drakengard 3, even when I realized it wasn't exactly what I wanted, probably boils down to what I was doing over that summer. The LSAT, or the Law School Admissions Test. It sounds pretty weird, but bear with me, I think there is a connection here. You see, I was staring down graduation, and as an art student with no clear idea of what to do next, I defaulted to what I thought was the most logical path. I started doing practice test after practice test, and pretty soon it all became sort of an obsessive game, where I chased after the next high score. Each week I'd have to come out with a better result than the last before I could allow myself to rest, which led to a sort of synergy I felt with Zero as she moved from one intoner to the next. At first this made me feel more invested in the game, but as time wore on, I started to get exhausted. As I got to the end of Drakengard 3, I was slowly losing steam in my studies, because there was no point. I still had no picture of what success would mean for me in the long term. No idea of what happy life as a lawyer would look like, if that's even possible. Zero would die, but I'd have to keep going, working my way down a path hemmed in with invisible barriers of my own making. So I gave ending D my best shot, spent a few hours trying to crack it, and ended up using a YouTube guide to get it done. Then I put down the game and my practice tests and moved on. Well, for me, I'll be starting a graduate degree in Communications and Media Studies this September. For the NieR franchise, though, I'm not sure. 4 years after lamenting his failure to shift gaming away from its dependence on violence, Yoko Taro managed an incredible balancing act with NieR Automata. It's a violent game with satisfying combat that somehow makes you want to throw away your swords and hug a robot. How do you follow up something like that? Especially if your entire career up to that point has revolved around themes of violence. I really don't know. As I see it, there's not much more that Taro can do when it comes to deconstructing violence through violence. I think for the upcoming entry in the NieR series, Taro should take a cue from Drakengard 3 and make a game that goes beyond violence in the gameplay, not just in the themes or the ending. I'm not saying the next installment shouldn't have any combat. I'm sure it will, and that's fine. But it should combine that with some other, more positive gameplay loop. Here, I'm thinking of a fantastic article I saw on Into the Spine, called Creating Life in a Dying World, where author Bryn Gelbart talks about how NieR Replicant's optional gardening systems helped him to find hope in its narrative of death and decay. What I'd like to see is a new NieR game that includes a similar system as an important, mandatory part of its narrative. Taro probably wants to jump timelines or dimensions for the next installment, as he so often does, but in case the next game is anything like Automata in terms of setting, then I have an idea, and it goes like this. You play as a machine lifeform fleeing the destruction of its community, perhaps by androids or some other force. This character and a small group of survivors want to establish a new colony of machines. Some simply want it to be a place where they can belong, others want it to be the beginning of an army that will eventually obtain vengeance. And you have to help them create the new machines, and guide them in one direction or the other. You could explore, gather parts, and put the machines together. Decide if this cute little guy needs a giant buzzsaw for an arm, Or if he should, I don't know, take some balloons instead. We as players could really dig into what it means to live and create life beyond violence. Or if that's even possible. I don't know, that's just my 2 cents. I'd be happy to play anything remotely like that. I just want to see Taro do what he seems to have wanted to do for a long time. Make a game that goes beyond those hidden barriers. He should take a cue from Drakengard 3 by making a game as different from Drakengard 3 as humanly possible. And that's the end of this retrospective. I'd like to clarify that I normally take a death of the author approach to narrative analysis. I focused a lot on Taro's intent here because I was looking at Drakengard 3 less as a story or single experience, and more as a piece of media within a series and an industry context. Speaking of Taro, I talk so much about him because he's an interesting character who allows people like me to condense the background of these games into short, simple stories. There are so many other people without whom these games would not be possible. For example, both Drakengard 1 and 3 were co-written by Sawako Notori, and let's also not forget producers Takamasa Shiba and Yosuke Saito, who I mentioned earlier in this video. To them, and everyone else involved in these projects, thank you. And thank you for watching my video. If you want to see more of my commentary content, keep an eye on this YouTube channel, or have a look at my written blog. You can also find a few short games by me on my itch.io page. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.